If an avoidant says this, they've already bonded to you. Imagine finding a locked room inside someone's house and spending months trying to figure out what's behind the door. You hear sounds from inside, you see signs that someone is there, sometimes the handle even moves, but the door never fully opens. That's what loving an avoidant can feel like. You sense depth, you sense emotion, you sense a connection that's real, yet the confirmation you crave rarely arrives in obvious ways. They don't always say the words you expect. They don't always express attachment in recognizable forms. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes people make with avoidance is waiting for dramatic declarations when the real signs of bonding are often hidden inside ordinary conversations. A single sentence, a small confession, a casual comment that sounds insignificant unless you understand what it actually means. That's what we're exploring today, because there are certain things avoidants say that reveal far more than they realize. And once you understand the emotional weight behind those words, you'll never hear them the same way again. And if you're fascinated by the hidden psychology of avoidance and want to understand what they're really communicating beneath the surface, hit subscribe and stick around, because some of the strongest signs of attachment are often the easiest to miss. One of the most surprising realities about avoidance is that the moment they bond with someone rarely looks dramatic from the outside. There is no emotional announcement, no giant revelation, no clear milestone where they suddenly declare, "You've become important to me." Most avoidants don't experience attachment that way. In fact, many of them are barely aware of how deeply attached they've become until much later. Bonding tends to reveal itself indirectly, through language, through habits, through moments where their guard slips just enough to expose what has been happening underneath. This is why people often miss the signs completely. They're looking for obvious evidence while the avoidant is speaking an entirely different emotional language. The relationship may already hold tremendous significance, yet the proof appears disguised inside subtle statements that seem almost casual. That's because avoidants often communicate feelings in ways that feel safer to them. They reveal attachment in pieces rather than declarations, fragments rather than speeches, hints rather than announcements. And if you don't understand the psychology behind those moments, you may completely overlook one of the strongest signs that they've already formed a genuine emotional bond. To understand why this happens, you first have to understand why avoidants guard their feelings so carefully in the first place. For many avoidants, emotions are not simply emotions. They are exposure, vulnerability, risk. The deeper the feeling, the greater the perceived risk attached to it. This creates an unusual dynamic where attachment itself can feel threatening. Most people experience bonding as comfort. Avoidants often experience bonding as comfort mixed with fear. They enjoy the connection, but they also become aware that they now have something to lose. They begin caring about someone else's presence, someone else's opinion, someone else's role in their life, and that awareness can feel deeply unsettling for a person who has spent years relying primarily on themselves. This is why avoidants often develop habits of emotional protection. They downplay their feelings, they minimize their needs, they act less attached than they really are, they keep certain thoughts private, they create distance whenever emotions begin feeling too intense. None of this necessarily means they don't care. Quite often it means they care enough for vulnerability to feel dangerous. The stronger the bond becomes, the more carefully they may guard it, not because they want to lose it, but because they fear what that attachment reveals about their dependence on another person. This leads to one of the most important distinctions in understanding avoidance, the difference between interest and bonding. Many people confuse the two. Interest is attraction, curiosity, excitement, chemistry. Interest is enjoying someone's company and wanting to spend time with them. Bonding is something much deeper. Bonding happens when another person starts becoming emotionally significant, when they stop being an experience and start becoming part of your internal world. Avoidants can experience attraction relatively easily. They can enjoy someone, admire someone, desire someone, but genuine emotional bonding is different because it requires trust. It requires emotional investment. It requires allowing another person to matter. That's why some avoidants can appear warm, affectionate, and interested while still remaining emotionally guarded. They enjoy the connection, but they haven't yet allowed that connection into the deeper parts of themselves. Once bonding begins, however, the dynamic changes. Their thoughts become more personal, their attention becomes more consistent, their emotional reactions become more meaningful. The relationship begins carrying weight. And that's exactly why the phrases we're discussing in this video matter so much. They often reveal the transition from simple interest to genuine attachment. One of the clearest examples appears when an avoidant says something like, "I don't usually tell people this." At first glance, it may not sound particularly emotional. It doesn't resemble a love confession. It doesn't sound romantic. It doesn't even seem especially dramatic. Yet psychologically, this sentence carries enormous significance, because what they're really saying is, you now have access to a part of me that most people never see. Trust is one of the rarest currencies in the avoidant world. They don't hand it out casually. They don't offer deep personal disclosures to everyone they meet. Most avoidants become highly selective about what they reveal and who they reveal it to. So when they voluntarily share something personal, painful, embarrassing, meaningful, or deeply private, they're doing much more than telling a story. They're extending access, they're lowering defenses, they're allowing someone into territory they usually keep protected. This could be a childhood experience, a hidden insecurity, a personal regret, a fear they've never discussed openly, a dream they've never spoken out loud. The specific topic matters less than the act itself. What makes the moment significant is the willingness to be seen. Because for avoidance, being truly seen can feel incredibly vulnerable, and vulnerability is rarely offered without emotional significance attached to it. That's why so many people underestimate the importance of personal disclosure. They hear information, the avoidant is offering trust. They hear a story. The avoidant is quietly revealing attachment, and often without realizing it, that single sentence becomes one of the strongest indications that the relationship has already crossed into something much deeper than either person may have fully acknowledged yet. And once an avoidant begins sharing pieces of themselves that most people never see, something even more meaningful usually starts happening. The disclosures become less accidental and more consistent. At first it may be a single story, then a private opinion, then a fear they normally keep hidden, then a regret they rarely discuss. Before long, you're no longer just learning facts about them, you're being invited into their inner world. This is one of the strongest indicators that bonding is already underway, because avoidants are often extremely careful about who gets access to their internal landscape. Most people only see the version they present publicly, the capable version, the independent version, the version that appears self-contained and emotionally controlled. But every person has thoughts they don't share freely, doubts they don't reveal casually, dreams that feel too personal to expose. When an avoidant starts letting you see those parts, they are doing something much bigger than having deeper conversations. They are gradually allowing emotional intimacy. They are testing what it feels like to be understood rather than simply observed. They are discovering whether someone can handle their complexity without trying to fix, control, or judge them. What's important here is that these revelations rarely arrive all at once. They emerge layer by layer. Each disclosure becomes a small act of trust. Each act of trust becomes evidence that the relationship feels emotionally safer than most. And when enough of those moments accumulate, the bond deepens whether they consciously acknowledge it or not. This is often when another phrase appears, one that sounds simple on the surface but carries enormous emotional significance underneath. "I feel comfortable around you." Most people hear comfort and assume it's a mild compliment. For an avoidant, it can mean much more. Comfort is not something they give away easily, because genuine comfort requires lowering defenses. It requires relaxing the constant vigilance that often accompanies emotional vulnerability. Think about how much energy it takes to maintain walls, to monitor your words, to manage impressions, to avoid exposing too much, to stay emotionally protected. Many avoidants become so accustomed to those habits that they barely notice them anymore. They carry them into friendships, relationships, and everyday interactions. So when they tell someone they feel comfortable around them, what they're often saying is, "I don't feel the need to protect myself as much when I'm with you." That's a profound statement. It means your presence has become associated with emotional ease rather than emotional danger. It means they can exist without constantly managing distance. It means their nervous system is beginning to trust the connection, and trust is one of the clearest foundations of bonding. People don't become comfortable where they feel threatened. They become comfortable where they feel accepted, seen, safe, understood. For an avoidant, reaching that point is rarely casual. It is usually earned through countless interactions that slowly convince them they could let their guard down without losing themselves. What makes this even more significant is what often follows: emotional relaxation. One of the most overlooked signs of avoidant attachment is the gradual disappearance of performance. Many avoidants spend years cultivating an image of self-sufficiency. Not because they're dishonest, but because independence became a source of security. They learned to rely on themselves, they learned to keep certain needs private, they learned to function without expecting too much from others. Over time, that independence can become part of their identity. But when they bond deeply with someone, something subtle changes. The constant effort to appear completely unaffected begins fading. They stop feeling the need to prove they have everything under control all the time. They stop managing every emotional expression so carefully. They become more spontaneous, more relaxed, more authentic. The shift can be difficult to notice because it happens gradually, yet it's incredibly meaningful. It signals that they're no longer relating to you from a position of emotional defense. They're beginning to relate to you from a position of trust. They no longer feel compelled to maintain the same level of distance. They no longer feel like vulnerability automatically equals danger. In many ways, emotional relaxation is one of the quietest but most powerful signs of attachment because it reveals how safe they feel when you're around. And then comes a phrase that has caused countless people to wonder what it really means. You're different from other people. At first glance, it can sound vague, maybe even flattering without being particularly important. But when an avoidant says this sincerely, it often carries far more weight than people realize. Avoidants spend a lot of time observing. They notice how people behave. They notice how people react under pressure. They notice who respects boundaries and who doesn't. They notice who creates emotional safety and who creates emotional chaos. Because trust is so important to them, they tend to evaluate relationships carefully. So when they tell someone they're different, they're often expressing something very specific. They are recognizing that this connection feels different from what they've experienced before. Perhaps they feel more understood, more accepted, more comfortable, more emotionally safe. Perhaps they find themselves sharing things they normally keep hidden. Perhaps they notice themselves wanting more closeness than usual. Whatever the reason, the statement often reflects emotional significance rather than simple admiration. You're no longer being compared to strangers, you're being compared to their entire history of relationships. And if you've reached a point where they genuinely see you as different, there's a strong chance the bond has already become much deeper than they are openly admitting. As this emotional significance grows, another fascinating shift often begins appearing in the way they talk. The future starts showing up in their language, not necessarily through grand promises or dramatic declarations, but through small assumptions that reveal where their mind is going. They mention an event months away and casually include you in the conversation. They talk about experiences they'd like to have and instinctively imagine you there. They discuss future possibilities without treating your presence as uncertain. These moments are easy to overlook because they often sound casual, yet psychologically they reveal something important. Human beings naturally include people in their future thinking when those people have become emotionally integrated into their lives. We don't build mental futures around individuals who feel temporary, we do it around people who matter. For avoidance, this can be especially significant because future thinking requires acknowledging attachment. It requires accepting that someone has become part of their emotional world. Even if they never explicitly say, "I've bonded with you," their language begins revealing it. The future slowly stops being just theirs. It starts becoming a space where your presence is naturally considered. And when an avoidant begins imagining you in places you haven't reached yet, it often means the connection has already settled much deeper into their heart than their guarded exterior would ever suggest. And perhaps nowhere does that deeper attachment become more visible than when an avoidant says something many people take for granted: "I actually miss you." For some personalities, those words come naturally. They appear whenever distance creates longing. But for avoidants, admitting they miss someone can feel surprisingly difficult because it requires acknowledging dependence on an emotional experience outside themselves. It requires admitting that someone's absence created an impact, that they notice the distance, that the connection matters enough to be felt when it's gone. This is why those words often carry far more significance than people realize. They are not simply describing a feeling. They are revealing attachment. They are admitting that your presence occupies emotional space in their life. And what makes it even more meaningful is that avoidants often spend considerable energy minimizing those experiences internally. They tell themselves they're fine. They distract themselves. They focus on other things. Yet despite all those efforts, there are moments when the truth slips through. Moments when the feeling becomes too obvious to ignore. And when an avoidant voluntarily admits they miss you, it often means the bond has already grown strong enough that denying it requires more effort than acknowledging it. What's fascinating, though, is that their actions often reveal this attachment long before their words ever do. This is one of the biggest reasons people become confused when trying to understand avoidance. They're listening for emotional confirmation while the avoidant is quietly demonstrating it through behavior. Bonding frequently appears in patterns before it appears in language. The avoidant starts making time for you. They begin showing consistency. They remember things you've mentioned in passing. They check in after important events. They notice shifts in your mood. They become increasingly aware of the details that make up your life. None of these actions may seem dramatic on their own. In fact, many of them look so ordinary that they're easy to overlook. But emotional attachment often reveals itself through repetition rather than intensity, through reliability rather than grand gestures, through the steady accumulation of small moments that communicate one simple message: you matter enough for me to pay attention. That's why actions frequently speak first. They bypass the avoidance discomfort with vulnerability. They allow attachment to express itself without requiring an emotional confession. And if you pay attention to those patterns, you'll often discover evidence of bonding long before the avoidant consciously recognizes it themselves. This becomes even clearer when you look at the small habits that begin forming once attachment takes hold. Human beings naturally create routines around people who become important to them. We develop rituals, expectations, familiar rhythms. Avoidants are no exception. The difference is that their habits often reveal what their words hesitate to express. Maybe they consistently send a message at a certain time. Maybe they remember details most people would forget. Maybe they check on you after something stressful. Maybe they instinctively share parts of their day with you. These behaviors may appear insignificant from the outside, but psychologically they carry tremendous meaning. Habits represent emotional integration. They show that someone has become woven into the fabric of daily life. You're no longer an occasional thought. You're part of the rhythm, part of the routine, part of the mental landscape they navigate every day. And this is exactly why losing those habits after a relationship ends can feel so painful. The attachment wasn't just emotional, it became behavioral. The connection found its way into ordinary moments. So when an avoidant develops consistent habits around you, it often signals that the bond has already moved beyond attraction and entered something much deeper. Their life is quietly making room for your presence. Then there is one phrase that may be among the most powerful of all: I can be myself around you. At first, this statement sounds simple, almost obvious. Shouldn't everyone be themselves around the people they care about? In theory, yes. In reality, many people spend years showing only carefully selected versions of themselves. Avoidants often become especially skilled at this. They learn which parts feel safe to reveal and which parts feel safer to keep hidden. They become experts at maintaining emotional control, experts at presenting the version of themselves that feels manageable. But authenticity requires something different. It requires trust. It requires believing that someone can see the less polished parts and still remain. The insecurities, the contradictions, the fears, the imperfections. When an avoidant says they can be themselves around you, they're often describing a level of acceptance they rarely experience. They're telling you that your presence doesn't trigger the same need for emotional self-protection. They're telling you that being seen feels safer than hiding. And that is not a casual milestone. It is one of the clearest signs that a genuine emotional bond has formed, because authenticity only flourishes where trust already exists. Ironically, this is often the exact point where fear begins appearing. Many people assume bonding should automatically create security. For avoidance, bonding frequently creates both security and fear simultaneously. The deeper the connection becomes, the more emotionally significant it becomes. And the more emotionally significant it becomes, the more there is to lose. Suddenly the relationship matters. Suddenly another person's presence carries weight. Suddenly vulnerability is no longer theoretical, it's real. This can create an emotional paradox that confuses both the avoidant and the person they're attached to. They feel closer than ever, yet they also feel more exposed than ever. They want the connection, but they become aware of the risks that come with it. What if they're hurt? What if they're disappointed? What if they become too dependent? What if they lose their independence? These fears don't necessarily appear because something is wrong. Quite often they appear because the bond has become important. The attachment has crossed a threshold where emotional investment is no longer avoidable. And while that realization can be beautiful, it can also be deeply unsettling for someone whose instinct has always been to protect themselves first. Understanding this fear is essential because it explains why bonded avoidants sometimes behave in ways that seem contradictory. The very connection they value can become the thing that activates their deepest vulnerabilities, setting the stage for behaviors that make little sense unless you understand the attachment hiding underneath them. And that is precisely why bonded avoidants sometimes do something that feels completely backwards to the person experiencing it. They pull away after getting closer. Few behaviors create more confusion than this. The relationship feels stronger than ever. Conversations become deeper. Trust begins growing. Vulnerability starts appearing. Then suddenly, distance, silence, hesitation, a shift in energy that seems to contradict everything that came before it. Many people interpret this as proof that the avoidant lost interest, that the bond wasn't real, that the connection meant more to one person than the other, but often the opposite is true. Sometimes the withdrawal happens because the bond became real enough to trigger fear. Remember, attachment increases emotional stakes. The closer someone gets, the more vulnerable they become to disappointment, rejection, dependence, and loss. For avoidance, those possibilities can feel overwhelming. So when the connection crosses a certain emotional threshold, their protective instincts may activate. They create space not because they feel nothing, but because they suddenly feel too much. This doesn't make the behavior healthy, it doesn't make it easy to endure, but it does explain why closeness and distance can coexist inside the same person. The relationship starts awakening needs they are not fully comfortable with, and their instinct is often to regulate that discomfort through space. Understanding this dynamic is crucial because it prevents you from automatically assuming that every retreat is evidence of emotional detachment. Sometimes it is evidence of emotional significance colliding with emotional fear. And yet, despite those fears, there are moments when the truth slips out in ways even avoidants don't fully intend. One of the most revealing phrases is surprisingly simple, "I was thinking about you." On paper, it sounds ordinary, almost casual, but psychologically it carries tremendous weight. Think about what they're actually communicating. Out of all the things competing for their attention throughout the day, your presence emerged in their mind, not because they were obligated to think about you, not because they had to, because they wanted to, because the connection exists internally even when you're not physically present. This is one of the clearest markers of emotional bonding. Attachment doesn't just affect how people feel when they're together, it affects how they carry one another in their absence. It creates mental and emotional continuity. The person remains psychologically present even when they're not around. For avoidance, voluntarily admitting this can be surprisingly vulnerable. It reveals attachment. It reveals emotional investment. It reveals that you occupy space within their inner world. And when those admissions begin happening naturally, without prompting, it often means the bond has become deeply rooted. You're no longer simply part of their experiences, you're part of their thoughts, part of their reflections, part of the emotional landscape they carry with them through everyday life. As that attachment deepens further, another profound shift often occurs. They start allowing you to see their struggles, not just their strengths, not just the polished version of themselves, the struggles, the uncertainties, the moments where they don't have everything figured out. This is significant because avoidants frequently build their sense of security around self-reliance. They become accustomed to handling problems privately, managing emotions privately, carrying burdens privately. Letting someone witness those struggles can feel incredibly vulnerable because it means surrendering a certain level of control over how they're perceived. Yet when a genuine bond exists, many avoidants slowly begin lowering those barriers. They share frustrations they normally keep hidden. They talk about challenges they're facing. They admit when something is difficult. They reveal fears they usually manage alone. These moments may not look romantic, but they often represent some of the deepest forms of trust available. Because trust is not only revealed through affection, it's revealed through exposure, through allowing someone to see you when you're not at your strongest, through believing they won't use your vulnerability against you. When an avoidant starts sharing those hidden struggles, they're often communicating something far more meaningful than attraction. They're communicating emotional reliance, not dependence but trust, the belief that your presence feels safe enough to include in parts of their life they usually navigate alone. Unfortunately, this is also where many people accidentally create problems they never intended to create. Once they start seeing signs of attachment, they understandably want certainty. They want reassurance. They want confirmation that the relationship is heading somewhere meaningful. And because the evidence of bonding feels encouraging, there's often a temptation to accelerate everything, to seek labels immediately, to push for commitments, to demand clarity about the future. The challenge is that bonded avoidants are still avoidants. The attachment may be real, but so are the fears attached to it. When pressure increases too quickly, those fears can become louder than the bond itself. Suddenly the avoidant feels overwhelmed, cornered, rushed. Not because they don't care, but because the emotional pace no longer feels manageable. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make after recognizing signs of attachment. They treat bonding as the finish line rather than the foundation. They assume that because trust has begun developing, it can immediately support the weight of every unanswered question, but healthy relationships often require patience during these stages, space for trust to deepen, space for safety to grow, space for emotional consistency to prove itself over time. Bonding is not something you force into certainty, it's something you nurture into stability. And ultimately, that's what real bonding actually looks like. Not a single phrase, not one magical moment, not one dramatic confession that removes all doubt forever. Real bonding is a pattern. A collection of moments that gradually reveal trust, vulnerability, emotional presence, and genuine investment. It is someone sharing parts of themselves they don't normally reveal. Someone feeling comfortable enough to lower defenses. Someone including you in their future thinking. Someone admitting they miss you. Someone thinking about you when you're not there. Someone letting you witness struggles they normally carry alone. These moments matter because they all point toward the same truth: you've been allowed into territory most people never reach. And that brings us to the ultimate sign they've bonded to you. It isn't a specific sentence, it isn't a perfectly timed declaration, it's the repeated willingness to let you into parts of themselves they normally keep hidden from the world. The fears, the hopes, the insecurities, the dreams, the contradictions, the authentic person beneath the protective layers. Because at its core, bonding is not about what someone says once, it's about what they consistently allow you to see. When an avoidant repeatedly chooses vulnerability over protection, openness over distance, and trust over self-containment, they are communicating something more powerful than words alone ever could. They are showing you that you've become emotionally significant enough to enter places within them that very few people are ever invited to see. And for an avoidant, there may be no greater sign of attachment than that.